Hey everybody, Professor G here. We've come to our first segment of American history, and I'm going to begin talking about the history of the Americas, beginning with the history of this gentleman you see here, the history of the Native Americans. Now, as you've probably noticed, my lectures are going to follow a different pattern, sometimes a different chronology than that in which you see in your book. This is because the book is going to serve as a supplement to my lectures. Historians have, as I said before in my previous lecture on historical methodology, in a historian's narrative, they're going to choose to emphasize different facts. And they're going to view certain facts as more important than others. Now, anytime you begin a history class on the part of the professor, there's always this problem of where to start. Where exactly does human history begin? As far as American history goes, when does American history begin? Who do you start with? Where do you start, right? The Europeans were the first to settle the North American continent, but as you know, there were already people there. So some history textbooks begin with Native American history, the history of the peoples who were already here by the time of European arrival. Some just begin with the Europeans. Your textbook is one of those. To be fair, it does give a little bit of information on the Native Americans, but if you've looked at it, the information they give consists of about 4 pages. So obviously I'm going to more than expand on that. And I like to begin with the history of Native Americans. Some people would argue that Native Americans didn't contribute much to American history as far as culture, as far as technology, as far as politics go. And I would differ in that opinion. While Native Americans may not have contributed as far as technology goes, and while their presence may have been greatly diminished by the arrival of Europeans, they nevertheless are a significant part of American history. And also they're a part of American history that is commonly misunderstood. So hopefully my lecture today will kind of bring some clarity to Native American history, and as a result help to clarify American history as a whole, because the Native Americans are always there. They're still there, right? You can go to a Native American reservation today and you can hear their history from their own mouths as opposed to hearing it from someone like me, and I would highly encourage you to do that. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of going to the Cherokee Reservation and watching a play they put on about the Trail of Tears. A very fascinating experience. But they're still there. They've always been kind of on the peripheral of American history. They're not very much talked about. But I'm going to be dealing with ancient Native American history, not necessarily modern Native American history, which we won't get much of in this class. But I'm even going to start even further back, and I'm going to talk about the origins and the evolution of humanity. So when asking the question, where does history begin, there's several different starting points that we can begin from. We could talk about early history in the Mesopotamian culture, right? The rise of civilization, such as the civilization of Babylon, of ancient Mesopotamia. We could talk about the ancient Egyptians. Perhaps we could talk about the development of civilization along the Yellow River in China. But I always start even further back to the evolution of humanity out of Africa, the movement of humanity out of Africa. Why? Because I think this helps to explain certain historical phenomena. It gives us insight into why we are limited in our physical understanding of the world. It we get to the development of human consciousness. It also helps us to understand things that may not have even crossed your mind. For example, the origins and the development of religion, the origins and development of even things like gender roles. Oh, my lights went out. I'm still here. Even the origins and development of gender roles, right? Things that we don't really give much thought to, but which affect our day-to-day life, I think can be traced all the way back. Before human beings even arrived on the scene, we see gender roles at play. For example, when we look at Australopithecus and the male Australopithecus going out and hunting and the female staying around, raising the children, gathering foods. But I'll talk more about this as I get into my lecture. Okay, so when I talk about human evolution, if you've taken biology, this ought to be familiar with you. If not, what I mean by human evolution is the process by which human beings developed on Earth from now extinct primates. It is generally agreed upon that the taproot of the human family, the origin of these primates, begins from about 16.4 to about 11.2 million years ago in what's commonly referred to as the Mycenaean epoch. The Mycenaean epoch, from about 16.4 to 11.2 million years ago. Now, the reason why it dates back to this period, we can tell due to geological evidence that there was a major climate change happening on Earth. Seasonal conditions led to increasingly colder weather. By the late Mycenaean epoch, in many regions began to be inhabited by ape-like primates. Also, the environmental conditions changed due to this sort of global cooling. Level forest, evergreen forests were gradually on the African continent, were gradually replaced by grassland. If you've ever heard of the term the African savanna, it's kind of this all-pervasive grass, right? You look out and all you see is just like rolling hills with grass. This is what's the type of environment that starts to develop in the Mycenaean epoch. And this is important because this type of environment provides different conditions in which these early primates had to adapt, in which they had to evolve. Certain physical characteristics that once worked in the forest were no longer useful on these grasslands. So during this period, for example, you get the development of bipedal motion, the development of walking upright, walking on 2 feet. You get once you get the development of bipedal motion, you get the freeing up of hands. Once you get the freeing up of hands, these early primates start to use their hands to develop early forms of tools that will play a very important role once humanity comes on the scene. Viewed zoologically, we human beings are Homo sapiens, a culture-bearing. Culture is a fundamental part of human existence. We'll talk a little more about culture later on. So we are a culture-bearing, upright walking species that lives on the ground, and as far as we know, as far as our best estimates go, human beings first evolved in Africa about 200,000 years ago. Anywhere from about 200 to 150,000 years ago is when we see the first evidence of Homo sapiens. We're now the only living members of what many zoologists refer to as the human tribe. Now we have many pre-human ancestors. You may have heard of Neanderthals, Australopithecus. This is what I mean by pre-human ancestors. From about 200,000 years ago, some very important characteristics start to develop amongst our pre-human ancestors. Perhaps the most important of which is the origin of human consciousness, the development of consciousness, right? Our ability to reflect on ourselves, to reflect on others. Now, there's a lot of debate out there as to how and why consciousness developed, and we're just going to kind of casually set aside those debates. They're all extremely fascinating if you want to look into them. But we have the development of human consciousness in our pre-human ancestors, development of group interaction and social dynamics, as you very well know, highly important to human society, right? The ability to interact and to work as a group. And this probably eventually led to the formation of language, our ability to communicate with one another. Also, number 4, you have the development of sexual differences. And once you have this development of sexual differences, you get what's known as gender roles. Gender is largely a cultural construct, and I would go as far as to say is it's completely a cultural construct. How men and women respectively ought to behave is largely determined by our cultural and societal influences. And we see these cultural influences start to develop even before humanity steps on the scene. This is how ingrained they are. This is why sometimes I get asked, well, why did it take so long for women to get the same rights as men? And I think a big part of that question has to do with the fact that these gender roles are so ingrained within us. Of course, that doesn't make these gender roles right or correct. I just think it's a good explanation as to why it took so long for men and women to share the same type of equality with one another. And finally, what also developed, the 5th element, is the manipulation of the external environment. Perhaps the biggest manipulation, perhaps the most important, I would argue perhaps the most important technological invention of all time is humanity's ability to utilize fire. Now that might sound very simple to you, but fire was a major technological leap forward from the past. And you see this play out in, for example, Greek myths like Prometheus. Fire was viewed almost as like a tool of the gods, like it had unimaginable power. Once we have the development of fire, once we are able to utilize fire, we can now cook meat. We can store food for longer periods of time. Food tastes better. What was once maybe an unedible object now becomes edible, a new source of nutrition for humanities. Also, it serves to ward off predators, right? It serves to light up the night, to make what was once hidden is now revealed. So fire had a huge impact on the development of human beings and eventually on the development of civilization. Now, as I said before, the first human beings appeared on what is now the continent of Africa about 200,000 years ago. However, it's not until about 60,000 years ago that human beings start to venture out of the continent to explore other areas for habitation. As to why they started to leave Africa, we're not entirely sure. Most likely it had something to do with it was probably something to do with climate change. Perhaps the weather conditions were changing, perhaps some patterns of the environment were changing. Another explanation, perhaps these early humans followed herds of animals, right? We know that early humans did follow herds of animals. They would follow them around. They were called hunters and gatherers, right? The males would get their spears and they would go out and hunt these large animals. And they wouldn't settle down in one place, right? They would follow these herds around because these herds were their primary source of food. Not only of food, but also once you kill the animal, you can use its skin for warmth, you can use its bones to make other tools, and all other sort of innovative ways that these early humans utilized these animals. So they would follow these herds around. So perhaps maybe they ventured out of Africa following a major buffalo herd or something along those lines. Anyway, by about 60 to 70,000 years ago, early humans ventured out of Africa. Now, the first place they started to settle is in what is now called the Middle East, right? Countries like Saudi Arabia, eventually sweeping into modern-day Iran, Iraq, and eventually making their way to India. So beginning about 50,000 years ago, humans started to make their way along the coast of modern-day Asia, if you can kind of imagine that in their mind. It's not until about 20 to 30,000 years ago that humans begin to venture into inland Asia, right, to countries like China, Mongolia, eventually the steppes of Russia. And this is what leads us to talk about North American history. About 15 to 17,000 years ago, there was, let me see if I have a map here. There we go. So about 15 to 70,000 years ago, there was an ice bridge called the Bering Strait, which connected modern-day Russia to modern-day Alaska. Now there's a sea in between those two areas. But about 15 to 70,000 years ago, we have very solid evidence that there was a land bridge connecting the two continents. This was due to a drop of sea level. I talked before about the global cooling that went on. In all likelihood, that global cooling led to this sea here to be frozen over, creating a land bridge between the two continents. And by about 15 to 16,000 years ago, early human beings start to make their way into North America via Alaska and modern-day Canada. How they did this, most historians and archaeologists agree that they came probably on foot, and most likely they were following, as I said before, early humans were big game hunters, so most likely they were following big game into North America. Some people also speculate that early humans came by boat, kind of hopscotching along the coast. Maybe, but most people accept that they crossed the land bridge into North America. Now, they came into North America. Typically, the migration pattern is agreed upon that early human beings came into North America via 3 different waves. Now, we say that there's 3 different waves based on genetic evidence. In the early 2000s, as you may or may not know, the human genome was decoded. Scientists such as Francis Crick and another massive team of experts were able to decode the human genome. And in doing so, kind of one of the implications of this is that they're able to trace human ancestry back to really far back in the past, right? So if you go on like Ancestry.com, for example, you can swab the inside of your mouth, send in your DNA, and they'll be able to tell you how far back they can trace your particular ancestry, where your ancestors came from, so on and so forth. Really cool thing. But they're also able to do this to determine the kind of genetic waves that came into North America. And so there's 3 slightly distinct genetic waves that come. When I say genetic waves, I mean 3 distinct kind of groups of people. Now they're all coming from modern-day Russia, the Siberia area, but they come into 3 different waves. This is the map that I have here of these 3 different waves. The first wave comes down through Canada into the modern-day North America, into the areas that we all live in and are familiar with. So These three different waves, after they enter North America, it only takes them about 1,000 years to reach Central America and to eventually settle down and inhabit South America. So in a very, very short period of time, these early human beings, beginning around 15,000 BC, sweep down into North America, and by 14 to 13,000 BC, have reached the very tip of South America. So a very rapid expansion. These are a slide talking about the three waves I was talking about. Right, Native American populations arose from at least three different migrations, with the majority descended from entirely from a single group of first Americans. Now, over time, they don't remain distinct. They start to intermingle, they start to interbreed. Cultures, individual cultures develop, but as we'll see later on, Native American culture is highly interconnected. Okay, so the Plains Indians and the Eastern Indians of the Appalachian region are going to be highly connected through trade, as we'll see. Okay. Native American history is different from, for example, Middle Eastern and African history in the way that it is chronologically classified. And this is because Native Americans operate on a different chronological timeline. Typically, if you take World History 1, for example, I'll talk about the Neolithic Revolution, the domestication of plants and animals, beginning around 12,000 BC. This happens almost simultaneously in ancient Egypt along the Nile River. It happens in modern-day Iraq and Iran along the Euphrates, in between the Euphrates and the Tigris River. And it also happens along the Yellow River in China and the Indus River in India. So almost simultaneously across the board in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, the Neolithic Revolution occurs. And so we could talk about that history kind of along the same timeline, but that's really not the case in the Americas. They go through different stages. Native American culture, for the most part, for most of the history, Native Americans don't really settle down. They don't develop the agricultural techniques. Now, some Native American tribes do, as we'll see, but most Native American tribes don't develop the agricultural techniques that we see developing in other areas. And this is largely due in part because most Native American tribes remain hunters and gatherers. They don't have to rely on the development of agriculture as other civilizations had to, because of the kind of plentiful resources that were available to them in the form of big game. But you don't really have to know these different stages. I just put it up here to show you that the history of the Americas kind of operates on a different chronological timeline than the history of the rest of the world, as far as the development of agriculture and as far as how civilization emerges there. So now we're going to talk about a series of what are commonly referred to as pre-Columbian cultures. These are a series of distinct Native American cultures that were existing before the arrival of Europeans. A lot of these we're going to go in chronological order. Most of these cultures had disappeared by the time of the arrival of Columbus. Now, the first distinct culture that we could talk about in the Americas is what's referred to as the Clovis culture. The Clovis culture. Now, the Clovis culture is it's called a megafauna hunting culture. They were the first hunters and gatherers to enter North America about 15 to 16,000 years ago is when this distinct culture emerges. And we base this culture on the development of these rather unique arrowheads that are found, these spear points. I shouldn't say arrowheads. They didn't have arrowheads quite yet. These spear points that are identified by archaeologists. The Clovis culture ranged over much of North America, and it also appears in parts of Central and South America, and again is identified by this distinctive style of spear point that was undoubtedly passed down from one generation to the other, the information behind developing the spear point. Also distinctive to the Clovis culture is that they were big hunters of woolly mammoths. We found Clovis campsites, and in these campsites we found woolly mammoth skins and carcasses and bones that have evidence of being cut and hacked by these stone spear points. And the Clovis people are considered to be the ancestors of most indigenous cultures in Native America. Since they're kind of the first group to settle the Americas, they are, for the most part, the ancestors of most Native Americans. Next up, we have the Na-Dene speaking people. This group, unlike the Clovis culture, is identified by the language that they brought with them. Linguists, in comparing Native American languages, are able to get at the root of these languages, and several distinct language groups share the Na-Dene language in common. The Na-Dene people entered North America beginning around 8000 BC, reaching the Pacific Northwest by 5000 BC, and from there migrating along the Pacific coast and eventually into the interior of America. So these people settled along the Pacific coast, eventually going into the kind of central plains of North America. It is believed that their ancestors comprised a separate migration. So the Clovis you could think of as the first major migration. Perhaps the Na-Dene speaking people were kind of the second migration to North America. They migrated into Alaska and northern Canada along the Pacific coast, and eventually into the Great Plains. So the Na-Dene speaking people, I talked about the linguistic evidence, the linguistic analysis that goes into this language. The Na-Dene language is undoubtedly the ancestor of the language shared by both the Navajo and the Apache people, the Apache Indians of Central America. Next up, we have a Native American society called the Poverty Point culture. Poverty Point. Now, these were the first mound builders. Mound building is a tradition of Native Americans. So in other cultures, you see the use, for example, in Egypt, the use of stone to build these massive stone temples or these stone pyramids. Native Americans didn't have access to the same types of stone that the Egyptians had, and so instead you see the building of mounds. And the first example of this that we have is the Poverty Point culture, and they're known as the mound builders. You can still go see these mounds today. There's some really fun. There's even some mounds here in Georgia, in North Georgia, out in Alabama, and especially in Mississippi, if you're interested. So the Poverty Point culture is an archaeological culture that corresponds to an ancient group of indigenous people who inhabited the lower Mississippi River Valley and surrounding the Gulf Coast from about 2200 to 700 BC. Archaeologists have now identified more than 100 sites belonging to this mound building culture. And we can identify them as mound builders to the distinctive way that they constructed these mounds. This is a picture here of Poverty Point in Mississippi. This is actually a historical site that you can go to. And I don't know if you can tell watching this online, but there are several layers here going down to this flat basin area. Now, most archaeologists accept the fact that so these mound builders, they're still hunters and gatherers, right? They're still moving from place to place. They haven't quite settled down yet. Nevertheless, they construct this massive structure. I think it covers about 46 acres. They construct this place. Most likely, it serves some sort of religious function. So they're moving from place to place, but at certain times of the years, they settle down. They settle down at specific spots, and this is one of the spots that they would stop at every year or so. And there's a massive amount of pottery evidence there, and there's also like little trinkets and stuff that we have found there, little effigy figures, like little human beings carved out of wood. And this suggests that this is some sort of ritualistic site, that perhaps in the center area is where they performed their religious rituals, their sacrifices, their dances. Nevertheless, the poverty point, the poverty point that you see here represents the largest mound building effort that we have in North America from this time period. Next, we're going to talk about the Hopewell culture. This is an artistic rendering of what Poverty Point may have looked like. Again, we don't exactly know what it looked like or what it was for. There's evidence to suggest that there was like a really big wooden totem here in the center, perhaps where the sacrifices were offered. Again, it's an artistic rendering. We don't really know what it looked like. So the Hopewell tradition begins about 200 BC and extends to about 500 AD. And when I say the Hopewell tradition, unlike Poverty Point, I'm not talking about a single culture or a single society. Rather, I'm talking about a widely dispersed culture that is identified due to certain key characteristics. And what is unique about the Hopewell culture is it is at this point in Native American history that we really get the development of a sophisticated political system. Another thing you should know about the Hopewell system is that they had a massive exchange system running up and down the Mississippi, extending all the way up to almost modern day Canada. So a massive system of trade and exchange between these people. Trading exotic materials from almost every region of the United States. This is a general map kind of showing you, again, this isn't exact, but this is kind of our estimation. And the reason we could trace this, the Hopewell system, it kind of centers here in what is now Mississippi, Louisiana, but we found Hopewell pottery, Hopewell trinkets, Hopewell beads in areas all the way up to the Great Lakes area. So this is why we know that there is this kind of massive system of exchange. It's because we found evidence of the Hopewell culture in all of these different areas here. The Hopewells also built mounds, as you can see in these pictures here, undoubtedly because they're from the same region as the mound building culture. Okay, Hopewell politics. The Hopewell peoples had leaders. What's eventually going to emerge in Native American society is the development of a chiefdom, the rise of the big men, the chiefs. You don't quite see that yet with the Hopewells, but you kind of see the foundation for it with the development of what are called big men, of important families that start to take prominence in Hopewell societies. And amongst these families, the people that are the most respected, right? These people are turned to in times of war, in times of conflict, for direction by the people in general. And this political system is what's going to kind of lay the foundation that we're going to see in the Hohokam culture. And that's actually the development of a chief, a tribal chief that we are most familiar with. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the Coles Creek culture. The Coles Creek culture. Again, this is centered along The Mississippi, a lot of these cultures are going to center along the Mississippi, and this is mainly for geographical regions. The Mississippi allows very easy transport. It always has, and it still does. It's kind of the middle highway of America. It allows easy transport up and down the North American continent. So the Coles Creek is a late woodland archaeological culture in the lower Mississippi. The period marks a significant change in the cultural history of the area. So during the Coles Creek era, population starts to increase. There is strong evidence of a growing cultural and political complexity, even more so than we see in the Hopewell tradition. Although many of the classic traits of chiefdom society are not yet manifested, by 1000 AD, the formation of elite politics has begun. So in the Coles Creek culture, you have kind of the solidification of these elite families, right? These families that carry more political clout than the other peoples. Also very important, during the Coles Creek period, you have the domestication of maize, the kind of ancestor to modern day corn, which would be a fundamental staple, a fundamental crop, not only for Native Americans, but as you know, is a fundamental crop for later Europeans, and especially today. I mean, corn's in read anything, any food that you pick up from the supermarket, and most likely it's going to have corn in it or a corn byproduct. So this is a huge development, not only for Native American culture, but for our society as well. Okay, so up next we have the Hohokam. We're an ancient Native American culture centered around the present-day state of Arizona. The Hohokam are unique because unlike the other cultures that we have discussed so far, the Hohokam were primarily an agricultural-based society. If you've ever seen, maybe I have a picture here. Yeah, so they're centered out in Arizona, and if you've ever seen pictures of the buildings that are kind of look like they're built into the sides of mountains, those were made by the Hohokam. This is their residence. However, they are perhaps most known, aside from their buildings, they're most known for their agricultural techniques. The Hohokam were perhaps the most agriculturally developed of the Native American tribes. They were the only Native American culture to rely on irrigation canals to water their crops. They were the first Native American cultures to utilize the rivers in their areas and to form a very complex system and a very extensive irrigation network. Due to their kind of agricultural prowess, due to their ability to manipulate crops, the Hohokam were also the first to cultivate various varieties of cotton, which, as you know, has been a staple crop in the United States ever since. Also of tobacco, of maize, of beans, and squash, as well as to harvest a wide variety of other plants. I said that the chiefdom developed during the Hohokam. It actually develops in the next cultural period that we're going to talk about, and that's the Mississippian culture. So remember, the Hohokam are known primarily due to their agriculture. It's in the Mississippian culture that we get the rise of the chiefdom. So the Mississippian culture is another mound-building Native American civilization that flourished in what is the Midwestern, Eastern, and the Southeastern United States from about 800 to 1600 AD. So these guys were still around. This culture was still prominent by the time that Westerners start to arrive in North America. Mississippian culture is known for several things. First of all, they're known for the construction of large pyramid-shaped mounds. which were used as either religious sites, sites for sacrifice, sites for religious rituals, and even for the burial of their dead. This is a maize-based agriculture. So as I talked about before, in North America, you have the domestication and the improvement upon corn of maize-based agriculture. Mississippian culture is going to rely on maize for a lot of its substance. So you're starting to see the gradual shift from hunting and gathering based Native American societies to more agricultural leaning Native American societies. You also have a very distinct style of pottery that emerges in the Mississippian culture due to the way that they utilized shells, shell-tempered pottery, as you see here. The Mississippian culture, also you see, again, widespread trade networks, and we see here the development of the chiefdom. Now, when I say chiefdom, basically you can think about this as in the West and nowadays how we would think about kind of a medieval king, right? Chiefdoms are characterized by centralization of authority and, as a result, pervasive inequality. This is another kind of mischaracterization of Native American society, that they kind of are unpolluted by politics, right? Everyone's kind of equal, everyone's on the same page. However, as in the West, with the development of a social hierarchy, with the king, or in this case, the chief being at the top, with this development of a stratified social hierarchy, you also have the introduction of inequality. Why? Because the reason the chief is at the top is because he is gathering resources from those beneath them. He is taking advantage of people. He's relying on his power to extort, in this case, crops and tradable goods from the people who don't have as much power as him. So a chiefdom is a form of hierarchical political organization in a non-industrial society, usually based on kinship. So these chiefdoms were kind of a familial organization, meaning that the chief came from a particular family line, a particular lineage. The development of a chiefdom as the primary political system also led to these further developments I talked about before, the institutionalized social inequality. Anytime you have someone at the top, you are consequently going to have somebody at the bottom who's being taken advantage of, typically poor farmers, as we've seen throughout history. Also, the centralization of control. The power now lies with the chief at the top, who's making the political and the religious decisions for the community as a whole. And finally, we have the beginning of a settlement hierarchy, in which the major center of influence with these mounds, centered around these mounds, has a central influence or control over a number of lesser communities. So you can kind of think of this in modern day terms, right? The chief would reside in his capital, and outside of the capital would be the smaller communities that would be controlled by the central city. So think of modern day Georgia, right? The largest city in Georgia and one of the largest cities in the United States is the city of Atlanta. Most Georgian politics is, as a result, dictated by what happens in Atlanta. The same thing happens here, right? You have the central city where the chief dwells, and all of these social decisions are made in this city. And with that, people are excluded. The people who don't live in the city are kind of pushed to the side. Okay, And now we get to our last great culture. Maybe some of you are familiar with this, and we get to the Iroquois, and specifically the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, the Iroquois Confederacy is important because it's the Iroquois Confederacy that a lot of Europeans, especially the British, these are the people that the British are going to be talking with, exchanging information with, exchanging goods and services with. By the arrival of Westerners, the Iroquois had formed a confederacy known as the Great League of Peace. Now, the history of the Iroquois Confederacy goes back to its formation in the 15th century, or perhaps maybe even earlier, bringing together 5 distinct nations in the southern Great Lakes area. Each nation had a very distinct language, and within the Iroquois family, kind of a distinct territory, but nevertheless, they agreed upon kind of the formation of a loose confederacy. Even though they had their distinct cultures and the distinct languages, they realized that it would be much better for themselves to come together and to form kind of a loosely knit nation in order to help with trade, in order to help with physical protection from other tribes. The League was governed by a Grand Council, an assembly of 50 different chiefs, each one representing a different tribe. According to tradition, the League was formed through the efforts of 2 different Native American Iroquois leaders. Representation was not based upon the population of the tribes, but rather upon an equal representation, one man from each tribe. There's been some speculation about whether or not this Iroquois nation had an effect on the writing of the U.S. Constitution. I haven't seen it. That doesn't mean that it's not the case. I'm not very well read in this area, but some historians have suggested that in fact the Iroquois nation served as a model for the U.S. Constitution. Because as you know, our modern day Senate functions in almost the same way. Each state is given 2 different representatives regardless of population. Okay, so I introduced you to these 7 different Native American cultures. And the purpose of this was to show you that we often think of Native Americans as kind of this monolithic people, right? That's kind of how they're presented in Hollywood depictions and in movies and in literature of our day. But Native Americans represent a highly diverse and highly developed society. And this is even the case once Westerners arrive. We tend to think of them as being savages, as being natives, as being somehow underdeveloped, right? As opposed to the highly technologically advanced Westerners. And this is a very common and pervasive misconception that hopefully this lecture has cleared up. All right, guys, that's it for today, and I will speak with you, ladies and gents, later.